I'm TerenceSimmons. This is U.S. History. My professor, Professor Trina Arnold. We're at Mid-America University, Christian University, and my research is on the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The civil rights movement of the 1960s began in the early 1900s. The culmination of the movement is in the 1960s. The movement in itself began when African Americans began to fight back against centuries of dehumanizing oppression. The movement was about blacks protesting injustice and oppression in America. The movement started really in the early 1900s, and there were several organizations that really began to help this fight in the early days. Really would be the NAACP as one of the early pioneering groups, and then coming into the 60s or the 50s and the 60s would be other forming groups such as the SNCC or the Southern Christian Leadership Organization or Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee or the SNCC, and the CORE, which is the Congressional or the Congress of Racial Equality. Those organizations began to form, fighting against Jim Crow laws and other forms of discriminations against blacks in America. The Reconstruction era brought on Reconstructional constitutional amendments that were added to the Constitution to help in the fight against discrimination and also to further civil rights for blacks. We have a video that will give further explanation to the Reconstruction constitutional amendments.
Well, the three Reconstruction amendments, 13, 14, 15, the 13th abolished slavery, the 14th established the principle of equal citizenship, the 15th tries to give black men the right to vote. These are all things which the federal government couldn't have conceived of doing before the Civil War. But the war itself empowers the national government, and the abolition of slavery leads, after a terrible political struggle, to the incorporation of black Americans as equal citizens of the society. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments each ends with a clause saying Congress shall have the power to enforce this amendment. In other words, it gives Congress the right to protect the basic rights of American citizens. And even though those basic rights of blacks were soon violated and taken away, really, in many of the southern states, nonetheless, those amendments remain in the Constitution, and a century later, they would be the basis, the legal constitutional basis for the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s. 100 years later, those amendments, Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts during Reconstruction, said were sleeping giants in the Constitution. And they did sleep for a long time, but then they were reawakened by the Civil Rights Movement and became the basis for the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s.
The Civil Rights Movement's main purpose was to end discrimination against blacks. There were some the purpose, of course, was also to promote socio-political issues, to promote economic progress for blacks. Another point of the Civil Rights Movement was to benefit or to promote the benefits of civil rights for blacks, and those benefits became evident through the Johnson administration. Of course, President Johnson, in passing several different pieces of legislation, notably the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a direct benefit, and with that signing, we have another video that will give clarity to that particular event.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Its purpose is national, not regional. Its purpose is to promote a more abiding commitment to freedom, a more constant pursuit of justice, and a deeper respect for human dignity. Let us close the springs of racial poison. Let us pray for wise and understanding hearts. Let us lay aside irrelevant differences and make our nation whole. Let us hasten that day when our unmeasured strength and our unbounded spirit will be free to do the great works ordained for this nation by the just and wise God, who is the Father of us all. Thank you and good night.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a definite benefit to blacks in America, but of course another part of the benefit of the Civil Rights Movement was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so thus, as a part of the Civil Rights Movement, it was necessary for the Voting Rights Act in order that blacks would be able to have the benefits of full citizenship, that they would be able to vote. It was illegal, of course, for blacks to be able to vote. Voter discrimination was very heavy, especially in the South. And so we found that they were voting poll taxes. There were different things that were different parts of the country, especially more in the South, where poll taxes, literacy exams, other parts of strategies to suppress the black vote that was happening. And so the Voting Rights Act protected blacks to be able to vote, and there was federal protections and safety, because with blacks being able to vote, they would also have a higher turnout in order to vote. So it was a definite plus, not only for the Civil Rights Act, but also for the Voting Rights Act of 1965 as a direct benefit. Of course, there were organizations that opposed the Civil Rights Movement, and we find that with that opposition in the South in particular, there were organizations, but one in particular, the White Citizens Council, or sometimes notably just called the Citizens Council, but it really would have been called the White Citizens Council, namely because their resistance to the Civil Rights Movement was to ensure that any organization or any group that resisted, or any group that came against white supremacy, or any group that sought, in their view, to undermine the white way of America, that they would resist that. And so the Citizens Council first started off being an organization, started off being an individual mandate that people would individually do, but eventually they would grow into a society, and this society would begin to spread all over the South into different regions, and that's how the councils would begin. We then find ourselves where legislation begins to become more favorable for the Civil Rights Act, and more so in legislation, the Republican Party at the time, in the majority of a two-party voting system in legislative Republicans and Democrats, Republicans seem to have been more favorable towards civil rights for blacks. And based on the percentage of Republicans and Democrats, being that there were more Democrats elected into official offices at the time, by the percentage basis, there were more Republicans that were in favor of blacks having their civil rights granted to them. And we have a graph that shows the percentages, or that shows you how the voting record was given for that particular time for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The thing that we find is that many of the civil rights leaders often suffered violence. There's many leaders that we are sad to say that because they believed in what the cause of civil rights was, they were willing to lay down their lives for the cause. Leaders like Reverend George Lee, Lamar Smith, Herbert Lee, Medgar Evers, these men were all killed by whites for just helping or encouraging people to vote. This was in Mississippi, and so many countless others that have given their lives, or even others that were caught in the crossfires of misfortune, being the wrong place at the wrong time. And they may have been the forgotten, the names that may not have been in the newspapers, but just happened to be the wrong place where vitriol and wrongdoing was able to be exercised without regard. We find that in the midst of the civil rights movement, that there was a strategy, and the strategy was a nonviolent strategy. The strategy, of course, being nonviolent because it was a necessity to know what was wise. And for blacks in America at that time, blacks did not have a vast arsenal of weaponry, and so it would not have been wise to wage a war in a militant style. So the way of nonviolence was the wiser way to go. And so what Dr. Martin Luther King had instituted, even to train those workers of the civil rights movement through the influence of his mentor in terms of what he learned from Mahatma Gandhi, was that the nonviolent way to resist would have been the best way to do so. So that was the way that it was done, through peaceful nonviolent protests, economic boycotts, and other ways to enforce civil disobedience against racial discrimination. We find ourselves at that place where the civil rights movement became effective in helping to push for greater jobs, to push for housing and schooling and those things that were necessary. The boycott pushed for those types of advancements, and so we were able to see those things as the boycott pushed. When we look for the economic improvements, those are the areas that we started to see as it was noted in a Stanford research study, that the effects of the civil rights movement was definitely noticed in the fact that blacks began to get jobs in areas where they were not previously employed. And so we started to see economic opportunities in local, state, and federal job sectors as a direct result of the civil rights movement. It is notable that throughout the centuries of watching racial oppression, that with every president, and there were 36 up through the era of President Nixon, you find that there were very few presidents that really were purposeful about changing the plight of Black America. But with the exception of these few, President Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon B. Johnson, these presidents seemed to be somewhat intentional in some of the things that they had done to directly affect the lives of Black Americans in terms of laws that would be far-reaching to change the lives and change the plight of Black Americans. The Civil Rights Movement did indeed lose many of its key leaders, and we saw that in the late 60s we lost a key leader in Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and even in that, many other leaders, not just him, but many other key leaders that were lost. But also there were many victories that were gained, and it does go to say that the sacrifices that were made were very high sacrifices, but those roads had to be paved in order that decades later on we would be able to see an African American man become the president of the United States of America decades later on. That would not have been possible without the life and the blood of many who had come before him, that had shed that blood, and it had to be a bloody issue in order for that to happen. So we saw the progress through tears and blood and lives lost, but victories were still yet won because of the Civil Rights Movement of the 60s. The modern progress that we have seen has been good, but then there's been a threat to that progress of the Civil Rights Movement of the 60s, and that threat has been that many have wanted to see those liberties that have been gained, see those liberties reversed. In some 14 states in the United States to date, and there may be more, but to date, to my report, that have threatened the progress of civil rights by passing laws that require voters to have identification. And it has been seen as a way to be discriminative against a certain group of people. We find that it is not only just a group of people, but now more so a class of people. And we see that has been a way to become a suppressive part of keeping people from coming to vote. We find that in itself, it has been noted that civil rights must continue, even though the 60s has been a long time ago. The struggle for civil rights must continue even today, and our society is still is not as segregated as it has been quoted to say. Is not as segregated, but is still substantially segregated through economic measures. And it is important to realize that that is Chris Graham that quotes that saying. It is important to realize that there are many veiled layers of racism and segregation that go on, but we have to know that the fight for civil rights is not just a war of color, but it is even still yet a war of classes in today's world, and we must still yet fight for all men to be free and to be respected in this world, not just the United States, but more so, we must make sure that our civil rights is everybody's human right.